In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 10 of your morphology lesson. As you know, in the previous sessions, I talked about the relationship between morphology and phonology, in chapter 3, and the phenomena which are related to this kind of relationship, the effect of morphology on phonology and vice versa. In this chapter, as you see here, I want to talk about the derivation and the lexicon. What is derivation and what is the lexicon in this domain, the derivation, as you see here. uh, First of all, I want to talk about the sign, the Saussurean sign. Ferdinand de Saussure, one of the first modern linguists, believed that language was a system of signs. He defined the linguistic sign as an arbitrary pairing between what he called significant, signifier, and particular, this signifier means particular sequence of sounds, and the signified, the concept that is denoted by the sound sequence. So this is the definition of sign, the relationship between signifier, the sequence of sounds, and the signified, the concept that is denoted by the sound sequence. These three terms, sign, signifier, and signify, are still standard in linguistics, and we use them in linguistics phenomena. So Saussure distinguished between motivated and unmotivated signs. A sign is motivated to the extent that by inspection you can get clues as to what it means. A walk signal, for example, at a crosswalk is an example of a motivated sign because the stylized image of a person walking indicates whether you should or should not cross the street. This is one of the sign system. The relationship between the form and the meaning. So this kind of signal, a walk signal at a crosswalk, is one of the examples of a sign. The other example, a stop sign. You see the stop sign in the road is partially motivated. So the walk side, the previous example, the crosswalk, it's a kind of motivated sign because by looking at the picture, the person walking across the street, you can find the meaning of that sign, so we call it kind of motivated sign. But a stop sign is partially motivated. The fact that it has 8-sided is arbitrary, but it doesn't any meaning, the direct meaning, but its red color is not. So in our culture, in this sign, red is often associated with danger and a call to alertness. So red is also the color lit up on a traffic light when drivers are required to stop. The number 8 is an unmotivated sign, so nothing about its form represents the number 8. So we have, as you see in this example, we have two kind of sign systems: motivated, like the crosswalk person in the road, and the unmotivated, like the stop sign in the road. This is exactly a kind of partial, motivated sign. So signs can lose their motivation. Consider the name of, for example, basketball team. One of the basketball teams is Los Angeles Lakers. This is the name of basketball team. The team started out in some land of 1,000 lakes, so it made perfect sense to call it to the Lakers. Once the team moved to LA, the other step of this sport, then Lakers made no sense at all. So maybe signs lose their motivation of, like this example. So motivation is not all or nothing, and signs can be partially motivated, as you see in the stop system, which I defined to you. So this is the definition of sign and the types of sign. I mean, motivated and unmotivated signs and partially motivated. And you see the examples, and you see that maybe signs can lose their motivation, like the name of that basketball team. The other part which I want to talk about it is about motivation and compositionality. What is the relationship between motivation and the compositionality? We can relate motivation to the logical notion of composition or compositionality. We say that something is logically compositional if it is defined entirely in terms of its parts. So, for example, the word doghouse is compositional. You see, its meaning composed of two parts, the meaning of dog and plus the meaning of the house. So we call it kind of compositional word. So at least in its original sense, it is compositional, because its meaning is derivable from its two components, dog and house, you see here. Because it is purely compositional, we could also call doghouse a motivated sign. So as you see, there is a relationship between motivation and compositionality. When a word is a kind of compositional word, we call it kind of motivated word. So there is a kind of relationship. Although if we break it down, dog house, the sound shapes of dog and house are purely arbitrary and unmotivated. But in the expression, for example, in the dog house, in a state of disfavor, the word is not compositional, since there is nothing in particular about dog houses that suggests that an occupant of one should be in disfavor. Another example of a compositional form from other languages, but I want here some example from. So look at the following examples. The following set of English words is particularly significant in light of partial motivation and compositionality. You look at this example: behead, to remove someone's head; befriend, to make yourself a friend to someone; besiege, to lay siege to; bewitch, to place under one's power as if by magic. You see these kind of examples? So our first response to this list is to say that these are all morphologically complex words. You see them. They consist of some words, for example, be plus head, be plus friend, be siege, and the other example. Formed with the prefix be, as you see. But are they motivated signs? In each case, the prefix be has a different effect on the meaning of the stem. In the word behead, for example, it indicates deprive of, but it means nothing of the sort in the other forms. This suggests that these forms are not completely motivated. The meanings of the stems in two are never lost, simply transformed. The forms are therefore partially motivated, so we call them partially motivated. The question of whether or not the forms in two are compositional is more difficult and depends in large part in our approach to linguistic analysis. It is undoubtedly the case that formation of words with a prefix be is no longer productive in English. Some linguists will nevertheless want to analyze forms like, for example, behead and bewitch as having two parts. Our approach, however, will be to say that these forms are stored whole in the lexicon. They are memorized. So we can memorize these words in our memory. We would say the same for forms like, for example, raspberry, boysenberry, or crayfish. You see that? While the isolability of the stems, for example, fish and berry, make it possible to isolate cray, rasp, and boysen, doing so is largely an academic exercise. We will assume so, at least until the opposite can be shown by experimental means. So the preceding data, as you see the examples, lead into a major issue to be addressed in this chapter: the relationship between derivation and the lexicon. As you see, this is the title of the chapter, the relationship between derivation and the lexicon. Recall that although some linguists consider the lexicon to be equivalent to the morphology, our definition of lexicon is a list of forms that the speakers of a language know or memorize. One question we need to ask is whether lexemes formed by productive derivational processes are ever stored in the lexicon. So in this chapter we want to talk about this kind of phenomena. We address this question explicitly in section 421 on compounding and 422 on zero derivation. In the remaining sections, 4.2, we present various types of derivational process so that students can become familiar with them. So we start with compounding. What is compounding and the relationship between lexeme and the derivational processes like compounding? So one derivational process we have already discussed is compounding. You see here. So here are some basic examples. For example, look at the example: English compounds tool plus bar, or amusement plus park, puppy plus love, coffee plus house, toolbar, amusement park, puppy love, coffee house. You see, to give a more extreme example, if someone asks us what Violet does for a living, we might respond, for example, she is a high voltage electricity grid system supervisor. You see here, there is evidence that high voltage electricity grid system supervisor is a single noun. First, its distribution matches that of any other noun, so we can insert it into a phrase like, for example, a good noun or noun for hire. Second reason is high voltage electricity grid system supervisor behave as a single unit for the purpose of WH movement. Question answer pairs that break it up or that are at the very least awkward. For example, in chapter 2 we relate this characteristic of word to the notion of lexical integrity, as you remember. So look at the example. Which electricity grid system supervisor did you see? This is, you see here we have all of the noun here. So this show us that this is the second reason which we consider these words as one noun. This is the noun. We can consider a kind of noun. So continuing with the notion of lexical integrity, we can ask whether it is possible to describe part of the string, for example, high voltage electricity grid system supervisor, with a kind of modifier. When we try, the result is very kind of awkward. You see, a very high voltage electricity grid system supervisor. The most natural interpretation of 7 is the figurative one, whereby very high voltage is used as an adjectival phrase modifying a smaller compound, for example, electricity grid, giving the intermediate form very high voltage electricity grid, which in turn modifies system supervisor, giving the entire form in 7. Finally, the other reason we can point to the structure of high voltage electricity grid system supervisor as evidence that it is a single noun formed by compounding. Words in English are generally head final, meaning that the lexical category of the form as a whole matches that of its final constituent. For example, dog sled is a kind of sled, not a kind of dog. The Red River Valley is a kind of valley, not a color or body of water. An affix with words like, for example, pollution take on the lexical category of the suffix. In this case is a kind of noun rather than that of the stem, for example, pollute, which is a verb. As speakers of English, we know this, and without ever having heard high voltage electricity grid system supervisor before, we know it designates a type of kind of supervisor. So phrases, in contrast to words, are less likely to be head final. The head of, for example, John's walking into work without a tie is a walking, not tie. And the head of the house on the hill is a kind of hill, is a kind of, house, not hill. So having established that high voltage electricity grade system supervisor is a single word of the category noun, we can ask ourselves, is this noun in my lexicon? This is a kind of important question. So probably not. This compound is formed by a very productive process and there is nothing irregular involved in it. It is absolutely compositionally and fully motivated. It's a kind of motivated word because it's a kind of compositional word. So words like this, for example, the high voltage electricity grid system supervisor, that are used but not stored, are called nonce form or hapex legomena. Nonce means a particular occasion, and hapex legomena is a Greek term meaning said once, that is used to refer to words that occur only once in the recorded corpus of a given language. The word that somebody made up, used, and then threw away. So we call these kind of words, which we use them once in our life, for example, and then threw it away, we call it nonce form or hapex legomena. So we don't store this kind of nonce forms in our memories. So this existence of nonce form is one type of evidence that speakers create words on the fly as they speak. So in discussing compounds, linguists sometimes use the term endocentric and exocentric. This is two phenomena which are related to compositional words. These terms are related to the notion of motivation and compositionality presented earlier. An endocentric compound is one that has a head. The head expresses the core meaning of the compound and it belongs to the same lexical category as the compound as a whole. For example, goldfish is an endocentric compound. It has a head fish, which determines both the meaning and the lexical category noun of the compound as a whole. Compounds whose lexical category or meaning are not determinable from the head are exocentric. For example, figurehead is just such a compound because it is not a type of head. Whether a compound is endocentric or exocentric is sometimes a matter of opinion. Look at these examples. For example, endocentric compound, jackknife is a kind of knife, board game is a kind of game, blue bird is a kind of bird, high chair, it's a kind of chair, sailboat is a kind of boat. So we call them endocentric compound because we can determine the head of the compound here. But the other examples, we call them exocentric compounds. Look at them. Funny farm, it's not a kind of farm. Lazy bones, it's not about the bones. Loony bean, it's not about the bean. Scarecrow and pickpocket. Again, you see here, we cannot, determine the stem based on these, word. So we call it exocentric compound. So we have two kind of compounds, as you see here, endocentric and exocentric, and I define the differences between these two kind of compounds as you see. If I ask you about some compounds and I ask you about the endocentricity or exocentricity of the compounds, you can define it according to the stem of that word and that composition. So for example, this is a kind of exercise identify each of the following compounds as either endocentric or exocentric. For example, look at this kind of example. Lawmaker is a kind of endocentric because it's about a kind of, maker. Makeup is exocentric. We cannot determine the head of this or stem of this word. No heater, exocentric. Mainstream, again we can call it exocentric. Wax wing is a kind of, again, exocentric. Playpen is a kind of pen, so we call it endocentric. Aftertaste, endocentric. And graveyard, again, endocentric. So this is a kind of exercise. You can read it again and you can determine the endocentricity or exocentricity of these compositional words. The other phenomena which I want to talk about, beside those compositionality, is zero derivation. What is zero derivation? So I want to talk about the zero derivation. Further evidence that derived words are not necessarily found in the lexicon comes from first language acquisition. While English-speaking adults typically have production vocabularies of, for example, 20,000 to 50,000 words, children's vocabularies are much smaller, ranging from about, for example, 50 to 600 words at age 2 to about 14,000 at age 6. To make up for this, children frequently coin new words. One way children do this is to use zero derivation or conversion. We call it conversion. A productive derivational process in English. Zero derivation changes the lexical category of a word without changing its phonological shape. So when we change the lexical category of a word, for example, noun becomes word, without changing its phonological shape, we call it zero derivation or conversion. The following example they are examples of novel verbs formed by 2 to 5 years old by zero derivation. Look at the examples. For example, the child said, "Don't hear me." You see here, hear is a kind of noun. So maybe the children use it instead of the noun form, they use it verb form. Don't hear me. This is a kind of zero derivation or conversion. Or, will you chocolate my milk? Again, chocolate is a kind of noun. The children may use it as a verb here. So this is a kind of zero derivation and conversion, and this example show the children can use this kind of phenomena, zero derivation, for producing new words. So the fact that children as well as adults spontaneously create verbs like to loan or to broom that they have never heard before tell us that there is more to morphology than the lexicon. So there is also a generative component. So furthermore, the fact that the verbs in the previous example were uttered once does not imply that they were automatically inserted into the speaker's lexicon, as we would be able to show if later on we ask the same children to describe similar situation and turn out that they did not use the nonce forms in 10 again. So they are a kind of nonce form. The children didn't and do not save this word in their memory. They forget this kind of words and they use them maybe once in their life. So we must mention directionality of derivation here. How do we know what a verb is derived from a noun or vice versa? If it is not obvious, we must research the answer in a good dictionary, one that contains etymologies. So it may happen over time that a word formed by a zero derivation or any other productive derivational process becomes lexicalized. Maybe we can lexicalize this kind of zero derivation form. So it is with the English verbs, for example, chair, leaf, ship, table, and weather. Another example of a verb that was originally derived via zero derivation but is now listed in the lexicon is mail. This is a kind of example. In this case, we know that the noun came first because it was borrowed from the French mail, which it means bag or trunk, or referring to the receptacle in which letters were carried. Evidence that the verb is now stored in the lexicon comes from its frequency. So this is the reason why we can save this word in our memory, the frequency of using of that word, as well as from the fact that its existence blocks the coining of a potential but non-occurring derived form, such as, for example, mailbox. We do not use this word, just we use mail instead of it, to put in a meaning is to put in a mailbox in order to send to someone. So this is a kind of zero derivation process. So maybe we can save this kind of words in our memory, like the mail here, and the frequency determine this kind of this kind of lexicon. So in this, as you see in this session, I talked about the relationship between lexical and the derivation and the lexicon. First, I defined the Saussurean sign, the signifier and the signified. As I told you, we have two kind of signs, motivated and unmotivated. The motivated signs are those signs which we can determine the meaning of the sign based on the form, but unmotivated signs, we cannot determine the meaning based on just the form of that word. So then we talk about the relationship between motivation and compositionality. As I told you, when the word is compositional, and we can determine the meaning of that compositional word based on the parts, so we can call it a kind of motivated word. And then we talk about two phenomena, the compounding. As you see, we have some kind of compounding here, and we talk about the two kind of compounding, endocentric and exocentric, and talk about the example. The endocentric, we can determine the stem of that compound, but in exocentric we cannot determine the stem. And the last one is the last phenomena which I talked about, it is zero derivation. As I told you, when we change the category of the word without changing the sound and the form of the word, we call it zero derivation or conversion. As you see from these examples, the children use this kind of phenomena for producing new words when they're child, and children and the other zero derivations, we use them in our daily works. So for example, we use this kind of word, for example, mail, and the frequency determine this kind of word, so we can save this kind of words in our memory and use them many times in our life. So I think that's enough for today. You can read this material in your book in this and you can hear the voice again. So if you have any question, you can ask me. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.